Kursk, Soviet Union, July 5, 1943, 3:30 a.m. The horizon glows orange, not from the sunrise, from artillery. 3,000 German guns open fire simultaneously along a front stretching 150 miles. The ground shakes. The air fills with smoke and dust. Trees explode. Houses collapse. Entire villages disappear in seconds. This is the largest artillery barrage in history. And it is only the beginning. Behind the guns, the tanks wait. Panzer IV, Panther, Tiger. Thousands of them, engines idling, crews tense, commanders scanning the grey dawn through their periscopes. They are the spearhead of Operation Citadel, Germany's last great offensive on the Eastern Front. Their mission, break through Soviet defences at Kursk, encircle 2 Soviet army groups, and restore Germany's momentum in the East. History records that Germany committed around 700 tanks and assault guns to the Battle of Kursk. It was the largest concentration of German armour ever assembled, and it failed. The Soviets stopped the offensive. The Germans were forced to retreat. Kursk became the turning point of the war in the East. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major offensive. It fought only defensive battles, retreating slowly westward until Berlin fell in 1945. But imagine something different. Imagine that Germany had twice as many tanks, not 700, but 400. Imagine that every panzer division was doubled in strength. Imagine that every breakthrough point had twice the armoured punch. Imagine that the Wehrmacht, instead of scraping together its last reserves, had the industrial capacity to field an armoured force that could overwhelm Soviet defences through sheer mass. Would it have changed the outcome? Would Germany have won at Kursk? Would the Eastern Front have stabilized? Would the war have lasted longer, or ended differently? The answer is not simple, because wars are not won by tanks alone. They are won by logistics, intelligence, leadership, and the will to endure. But tanks matter. In 1943, on the open steppes of Russia, they mattered more than almost anything else. And doubling Germany's tank strength at Kursk would have changed the battle in ways that are difficult to imagine and terrifying to contemplate. This is not alternate history. This is a thought experiment. A way to understand what actually happened by imagining what might have happened. A way to see the real battle more clearly by seeing it through the lens of a battle that never was. So let us imagine. Let us imagine the Battle of Kursk fought with twice as many German tanks. To understand what that would mean, we must first understand what actually happened. By the summer of 1943, Germany had been fighting in the Soviet Union for 2 years. The initial invasion, Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had been a stunning success. German armies advanced hundreds of miles. They encircled entire Soviet armies. They reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad. Victory seemed inevitable, but the Soviets did not collapse. They retreated, but they did not surrender. They traded space for time. They evacuated their factories beyond the Ural Mountains. They mobilized their population. They built new armies. And in the winter of 1941, they counterattacked. The Germans were pushed back from Moscow. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had been stopped. In 1942, Germany launched a new offensive in the south, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The campaign reached Stalingrad, and there, in the ruins of that city, the German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed. Over 300 German soldiers were killed or captured. It was the worst defeat in German history. By early 1943, Germany was on the defensive. The Soviets were pushing westward. The question was not whether Germany could win the war in the East. The question was whether it could avoid losing it. Hitler needed a victory. He needed to restore German morale. He needed to prove that the Wehrmacht was still capable of offensive operations. And he needed to destroy enough Soviet strength to stabilize the front and buy time for Germany to develop new weapons, jet aircraft, advanced submarines, ballistic missiles that might still turn the war. The opportunity appeared at Kursk. During the winter Soviet offensive, a large salient, a bulge in the front line, had formed around the city of Kursk. The salient was 120 miles wide and 90 miles deep. It stuck out like a thumb into German-held territory, and it was vulnerable. If German forces attacked from the north and south simultaneously, they could cut off the salient, encircle the Soviet forces inside, and destroy two entire army groups. It was a classic pincer movement, simple, elegant, potentially decisive. Hitler approved the plan, but he delayed. He wanted to wait for new tanks. The Panther, a medium tank designed to counter the Soviet T-34, was just entering production. The Tiger, a heavy tank with thick armor and a powerful 80-millimeter gun, was still rare. Hitler believed that if he waited a few more weeks, he could equip his panzer divisions with enough new tanks to guarantee success. The Soviets used the delay to prepare. They knew the attack was coming. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German high command. They knew the date, the location, and the objectives, and they used that knowledge to build the most formidable defensive system in military history. The Kursk salient was turned into a fortress. 8 defensive belts, each several miles deep, stretched across the salient. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields. Over 1 million mines were laid. Artillery positions were dug in and camouflaged. Anti-tank guns were positioned in depth, covering every approach. And behind the defenses, the Soviets massed their reserves, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and infantry divisions ready to counterattack the moment the German offensive stalled. By July 1943, the Soviets had concentrated 3 million men, 600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 400 aircraft in and around the Kursk salient. Germany had 900,000 men, 700 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft. The Germans were outnumbered, but they believed that superior tactics, better trained crews, and the quality of their new tanks would be enough. They were wrong. The offensive began on July 5, 1943. In the north, Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army attacked with 600 tanks. In the south, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf attacked with over 200 tanks. The plan was to break through the Soviet defenses, drive deep into the salient, and link up behind Kursk, trapping the Soviet forces. The northern attack stalled almost immediately. Model's tanks ran into minefields and concentrated anti-tank fire. Soviet artillery, pre-positioned and zeroed in on likely German assembly areas, inflicted heavy casualties. The Germans advanced only 6 miles in the first 3 days. Model's infantry suffered horrific losses. His tank strength was cut in half. By July 10th, the northern offensive had failed. The southern attack fared better at first. Manstein's forces broke through the first 2 defensive belts. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, equipped with Tigers and Panthers, drove forward. By July 11th, they had advanced 40 miles and were approaching the town of Prokhorovka. If they broke through there, they could turn north and begin the encirclement. The Soviets responded by committing their reserves. On July 12th, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, with over 800 tanks, attacked 2 SS Panzer Corps near Prokhorovka. The result was the largest tank battle in history. Over 500 tanks clashed in an area of a few square miles. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, close range. Tanks fired at distances of less than 100 meters. Crews bailed out of burning vehicles. The battlefield was covered in smoke, dust, and fire. The Germans won tactically. They destroyed more Soviet tanks than they lost, But they did not break through. The Soviet attack disrupted their advance, and more importantly, it bought time. Soviet reinforcements arrived, German losses mounted, Manstein's offensive ground to a halt. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Italy was collapsing. German reserves were needed in the west. The offensive at Kursk was over. It had lasted 8 days. The Germans had advanced no more than 40 miles. They had failed to encircle the Soviet forces, and they had lost over 200 Suggezerin men and 760 tanks. The Soviets immediately counterattacked. They drove the Germans back. By August, the Soviets had recaptured Kharkov. By September, they had reached the Dnieper River. The Germans were in full retreat. Kursk was the end of German offensive capability in the east. From that point on, Germany fought only defensive battles. The Red Army advanced steadily westward. It would not stop until it reached Berlin. That is what happened. Now let us imagine what might have happened if Germany had twice as many tanks. Imagine that Germany committed not 2 700 tanks, but 5 400. Imagine that every panzer division had twice as many tanks. Imagine that the breakthrough at Prokhorovka was not led by 600 tanks, but by 200. Imagine that Model's northern attack was not slowed by attrition, but sustained by reserves. Imagine that Manstein's southern thrust had the mass to overrun defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. What would that look like? First, consider the immediate tactical impact. The German problem at Kursk was not a lack of skill or tactics. German tank crews were the best trained in the world. German commanders understood combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, artillery, armor, and air support. The problem was that Soviet defenses were too deep, too dense, and too well prepared. Every German advance was met by minefields, anti-tank guns, and counterattacks. The Germans could break through one defensive belt, but by the time they reached the second or third, they had lost so many tanks that the offensive momentum was gone. With twice as many tanks, that calculation changes. A German Panzer division with 200 tanks instead of 100 could afford to lose 50 tanks breaking through the first defensive belt and still have 150 tanks to continue the advance. It could leave behind infantry to secure captured ground and push forward with armor. It could sustain losses and keep attacking. In the north, Model's attack would not have stalled on the first day. With 200 tanks instead of 600, he could have punched through the first 2 defensive belts and reached the town of Ponieri by July 7th instead of July 10th. The Soviet defenders would have been overwhelmed. Model could have committed his reserves earlier, exploited breakthroughs faster, and driven deeper into the salient before the Soviets could react. In the south, Manstein's offensive would have been devastating. With 2 400 tanks instead of 200, he could have attacked on a broader front, creating multiple breakthroughs simultaneously. The Soviets would have been forced to spread their reserves, weakening their counterattack capability. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, instead of fighting a grinding battle at Prokhorovka, could have bypassed the town entirely, leaving follow-on forces to deal with Soviet counterattacks while the armored spearhead drove north. But numbers alone do not win battles. Logistics matter. And here is where the thought experiment becomes complicated. Tanks need fuel. A Panzer IV consumed 200 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. A Tiger consumed 500 liters. An army of 400 tanks would consume over 1 million liters of fuel per day. Germany's supply lines were already overstretched. Rail networks in occupied Russia were damaged. Fuel depots were hundreds of miles behind the front. Every liter of fuel had to be transported by truck, and those trucks also consumed fuel. Doubling the number of tanks would double the fuel requirement. Could Germany supply it? Possibly. Germany still controlled the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. Synthetic fuel plants were operating in Germany. But the fuel would have to reach the front, and the deeper the German advance, the longer the supply lines, the more vulnerable to partisan attacks, airstrikes and breakdowns. The Soviets would also adapt, facing twice as many German tanks. Soviet commanders would commit their reserves earlier. The 5th Guards Tank Army would not wait until July 12th to counterattack. It would attack on July 8th or July 9th, hitting the German flanks before the breakthrough was complete. The Soviets had depth. They had multiple defensive belts, and they had the ability to trade space for time, falling back to prepared positions, forcing the Germans to advance farther, stretching their supply lines, exhausting their crews. But even accounting for logistics and Soviet adaptation, doubling German tank strength would have made Kursk a very different battle. The most likely outcome is that the Germans would have broken through, not everywhere, not completely, but they would have penetrated deep enough to threaten the encirclement of Soviet forces in the salient. By July 15th, Model's forces in the north and Manstein's forces in the south might have been within 20 miles of linking up. The Soviet commanders would have faced a terrible choice: pull back and abandon Kursk, or fight and risk encirclement. Stalin hated retreats. He had issued Order No, 227, in 1942, not one step back. Soviet commanders who retreated without permission were shot. But encirclement meant destruction. An entire army group, perhaps 500 Zauzuzeren men, could be trapped and annihilated. If the Soviets retreated, the Germans would have won a significant tactical victory. They would have captured Kursk. They would have straightened the front line. They would have inflicted heavy losses on the Red Army. German morale would have been restored. Hitler could have claimed vindication. The Wehrmacht could have argued that it was still capable of offensive operations. But would it have changed the outcome of the war? No, because even a German victory at Kursk would not have solved Germany's fundamental problems. First, Germany was losing the war of production. In 1943, the Soviet Union produced 24 Zauzuzeren tanks. Germany produced 12 Zauzuzeren. The United States produced 29 Zauzuzeren. Even if Germany destroyed 2 Zonderland Soviet tanks at Kursk, the Soviets would replace them within 2 months. Germany could not replace its losses that quickly. Every tank destroyed at Kursk was a tank that would not be available to defend against the next Soviet offensive. Second, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Italy was collapsing. By September, Italy surrendered and the Allies landed on the Italian mainland. Germany had to divert divisions to Italy, to France to defend against the expected Allied invasion, and to the Balkans to suppress partisan uprisings. Even if Germany won at Kursk, it could not concentrate all its forces in the east. Third, the Soviets had learned how to fight. In 1941, the Red Army was disorganized, poorly led, and poorly equipped. By 1943, it had become a professional fighting force. Soviet commanders understood defensive warfare. They understood how to use artillery. They understood how to coordinate tank and infantry attacks. They understood how to trade space for time and then counterattack. Winning one battle would not change that. Fourth, Germany was running out of manpower. In 1943, Germany mobilized every available man. It lowered the conscription age. It raised the maximum age. It combed through rear area units, searching for men who could be sent to the front. But the losses were unsustainable. At Kursk, Germany lost over 200 Zauzuzeren men. Even a victorious Kursk would have cost Germany 150 Zauzuzeren casualties. Those men could not be replaced. The Red Army, by contrast, had a vast population to draw on. Soviet losses were horrific, but they were sustainable. So even if Germany had twice as many tanks, even if it had broken through at Kursk, even if it had encircled and destroyed 2 Soviet army groups, it would have been a tactical victory with no strategic impact. The Soviets would have retreated, rebuilt, and attacked again. and Germany, having expended its last reserves in one final offensive, would have been even weaker when the next Soviet attack came. But let us imagine further. Let us imagine not just that Germany had twice as many tanks at Kursk, but that it had the industrial capacity to sustain that level of armored strength. Let us imagine that Germany could replace its losses, that it could field 5 Zero-Zero tanks, not just in July 1943, but in August, September, October. Let us imagine that Germany could fight a mobile, offensive war in the east while also defending in the west and south. That scenario requires us to imagine a different Germany. A Germany that did not invade the Soviet Union in 1941. A Germany that focused on building up its industrial base instead of conquering territory. A Germany that prioritized production over ideology. But that was not Hitler's Germany. Hitler believed in Lebensraum, living space in the East. He believed that Germany needed to conquer the Soviet Union to secure resources and territory. He believed that Slavs were subhuman and that the Soviet Union would collapse under the first blow. He believed in willpower over logistics, in ideology over economics. And so Germany invaded the Soviet Union with insufficient forces, inadequate logistics, and no long-term plan. It won spectacular victories in 1941 and 1942, but it could not sustain them. And by 1943, the war had turned into a grinding attrition that Germany could not win. Doubling the number of tanks at Kursk would have made the battle bloodier, longer, and more destructive. It might have given Germany a temporary victory, but it would not have changed the fundamental trajectory of the war, because wars are not won by tanks alone. They are won by economies. They are won by populations. They are won by alliances. And by 1943, Germany was losing on all three fronts. Let us return to the actual battle, to the fields around Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, where over 500 tanks clashed in the largest armored battle in history. Imagine that scene with twice as many German tanks. Imagine 200 Panthers and Tigers instead of 600. Imagine the sky black with smoke, the ground shaking with explosions, the air filled with the scream of shells and the roar of engines. Imagine Soviet T-34s charging forward, trying to close the distance to negate the range advantage of German guns. Imagine Tigers firing at over 1,000 meters, each shot punching through Soviet armor. Imagine Panthers maneuvering, flanking, coordinating their attacks. The battlefield would have been apocalyptic. Soviet losses would have been catastrophic. The 5th Guards Tank Army, instead of losing 400 tanks, would have lost 700 or 800. The Soviet counterattack would have failed completely, and Manstein's forces would have broken through. But beyond Prokhorovka lay more defensive belts, more anti-tank guns, more minefields, and more Soviet reserves. The Germans would have advanced, but they would have bled, and eventually they would have stopped, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they ran out of fuel, ammunition, and men. That is the reality of mechanized warfare. Tanks are powerful, but they are not invincible. They require supply. They require maintenance. They require support from infantry, artillery, and air power. And they require an objective that, once captured, changes the strategic situation. At Kursk, there was no such objective. Even if Germany had encircled and destroyed the Soviet forces in the salient, the Red Army would have rebuilt. The front line would have shifted. The war would have continued. And so we return to the question, what would it have been like if the Battle of Kursk was fought with twice as many German tanks? The answer is, it would have been more violent, more destructive, and possibly more successful tactically, but it would not have been enough, because by 1943, Germany had already lost the war. It had lost it in the factories of the Soviet Union, where tanks were being built faster than Germany could destroy them. It had lost it in the shipyards of the United States, where Liberty ships were being launched faster than U-boats could sink them. It had lost it in the strategic decisions made in 1941, when Hitler chose conquest over consolidation, ideology over pragmatism, and willpower over logistics. Kursk was not the moment Germany lost the war. It was the moment Germany realized it had already lost. Doubling the number of tanks would have delayed that realization. It would have given Germany a few more months, maybe a year. But it would not have changed the outcome. The Battle of Kursk was fought with 700 German tanks. It was the largest concentration of German armor in history, and it was not enough. If it had been fought with 400 tanks, it still would not have been enough, because wars are not won by weapons, they are won by nations. And in 1943, Germany was a nation that had overreached, overextended, and exhausted itself in pursuit of an empire it could never hold. Kursk was the proof. Imagine it with twice as many tanks. Imagine the fire, the smoke, the destruction. Imagine the Soviet defenses crumbling. Imagine the German breakthrough. And then imagine the next Soviet offensive, and the one after that, and the one after that, because that is what would have happened. The Soviets would have kept coming, and eventually Germany would have run out of tanks, fuel, men, and time. That is the lesson of Kursk. Not that tanks don't matter, but that they are not enough. Germany learned that lesson in the summer of 1943, and it spent the next 2 years retreating westward, fighting defensive battles, losing ground, until the Red Army reached Berlin and the war was over. Doubling the tanks at Kursk would have made the battle different, but it would not have made the war different, and that is the most terrifying realization of all.